we'll kick it off to Nina and Emily.
Good morning, everybody. Because we are such a large group, we're not going to obviously do introductions, but we would love folks to, if they're up for it, just introduce themselves in the chat with the name. And if you want your organization, that would be great. That way folks know who else is in the room with them this morning. And Jen, are you good? You see this? Okay, so here we go. Fundamentals of conducting focus groups and key informant interviews. Today, we are fortunate enough to work with TTask, CPIS, and DEMIS. Those are the sponsoring organizations that have brought Emily and I here today. And who are we? So hi, I'm Nina, and I know some of you, but there are a lot of you I don't know. It's nice to see you, although I only see a few faces at a time because I'm sharing my screen. My background, so I've been working as an independent consultant in Connecticut for just about 18 years. And most of my work is in the public health arena. I do a lot of work in the prevention field, especially with community organizations that might need support in evaluation, strategic planning, needs assessment work. And I really do love that level of community engagement. I also do work in the broader public health field with folks who might need help with program evaluation or community health needs assessments. So that's, is there an echo? So we are, so I'm fortunate enough that I've done many focus groups and key informant interviews in this role that I play. And so I'm really able to share my experiences with you that I've learned, some lessons learned with you today. And I'm also here with Emily, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Melnick, and many of the same things that Nina said about herself, I could also say about myself. I've been in Connecticut for 10 years. I was in the Midwest prior to that. And in addition to working with many of you in the prevention area, I also work in many local public health departments doing both evaluation and strategic planning, as well as folks in the workforce development field. And Nina and I, while we are independent consultants, often come together and collaborate with each other. And one of the things that we know many of you are kind of work independently or work with very small numbers of people. And so one of the things I just want to put out there is Nina and I are available after this if you need any support. We have a very ambitious agenda today and want to make sure we cover a lot of topics, but there's certainly we wouldn't expect that after this meeting or after this webinar you'd feel ready to rush off and go do this work. So you will get copies of our slides with our contact information, and please feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you might have after today.
So ground rules. So in a focus group and in a meeting of any type, you always start out with covering your ground rules. Jen already did some of this, but we're also trying to model for you how a focus group might run. And this would be one of the first things after introductions that you would want to cover. Obviously, confidentiality is very important to establish at the start of your meeting. We are going to go into a little bit more detail on this later on, and we do have some language we can share with you. Questions, as Jen said, please use the chat. We're going to try and answer questions as we go through this, so feel free to ask, and we will also hopefully have some time at the end of the presentation to cover questions. In a focus group, we would ask that all participants had their cameras on. I mean, that's really kind of a deal breaker. You need to be able to see the faces and read the body language of the people who are in your discussion group with you. Obviously for today, that is not an issue, but please do mute your microphones if you're not speaking. It just causes a lot of feedback. As Jen said, we will be sharing our slides at the end of this, and we really want folks to share their individual experiences if they can ever contribute to any of the slides that we put up there. We know you're coming from different types of work. Some of you are in the prevention field, others might not be. So please share your unique experiences as we go through this. We'd love to hear from you. Our objectives are listed here. As Emily said, they're quite ambitious. We're going to try to get through all of this as quickly and efficiently as we can to leave time for some discussion at the end. We do want to spend a minute before we move forward. We typically, when you're doing a focus group, you like to be able to collect information from the people who are in your group. And the easiest way to do that is through a simple survey. We found that when doing these focus groups virtually, the easiest thing to do is to drop a SurveyMonkey link into the chat or some other Google form or whatever you're typically using and collect basic information, basic demographics about the people in the room that you'll then have for your summary, and information that might be related to the areas you're discussing. So when we conducted focus groups about a year ago on the impact of COVID and substance use and mental health, we asked some questions on a survey tool about those issues. Very short, very simple, but Emily just dropped that in. Feel free to open that up. You can complete the survey if you'd like. You can just take a look at it, but we wanted you to see the process that we've used that we feel works pretty well. And when you're doing a focus group in person, you can actually have a QR code that folks could scan with their phones or hard copy, paper copies of a survey for somebody to fill out. So icebreakers, I'm sure almost every single person in this group has done an icebreaker before. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but I did want to say, when you are doing these focus groups, it's a really great way to set the tone of your session. You want the question or the icebreaker to be very sort of simple and light. The ones we typically use are, what is your favorite? Or, you know, I've used one, what superpower would you have if you could pick one? You really want to be sort of cognizant of the fact that you want your questions to be universal. So you don't want to ask possibly something about your favorite place to go on vacation. You want to make sure that you're not really setting the stage on any sort of equity issues or making people feel sort of uncomfortable in the question that you're asking. So really try to set the stage with a universal question and something that would make almost everybody feel comfortable. That's really why you're doing this icebreaker. Another thing I've noticed is you really want everybody to have a chance to speak before you get into your focus group. Just having them be able to hear their voice if you're doing something virtually is really important. And it's, you know, similar situation if you're in person, because for some people it can be a little bit intimidating or they could be a little bit nervous about it. So it just literally gives people a chance to talk, which is another great benefit of doing these icebreakers. Okay, so a little bit of background. Qualitative data versus quantitative data. Focus groups and key informant interviews are qualitative data. You might also hear these being described as anecdotal data. Whatever they're called, it is still very valid and very informative to your work to collect this type of data. Many of you might be more familiar with quantitative data, which would be a survey, something that you would be able to summarize, or you might go on to the CDC website and pull off some data that they've collected. That's quantitative data, also very important. But what we're talking about today is this qualitative piece. And you also want to consider in your background in this work that you do is why is there a need to conduct a focus group or a key informant interview? You need to ask yourself or your team that you're working with what the information is that you're looking to collect and how you're going to use it in the future. And you need to think about that because this is an investment in time and resources, and you need to make sure you're doing these for the right reasons. And we will get into more detail on this.
Okay, I'm gonna, Nina and I are gonna take turns going back and forth. So as Nina said, while qualitative data is important and we're gonna be talking about it, it is resource intensive, typically in terms of your time. Surveys sometimes cost a lot of money, which maybe focus groups might not unless you need to rent a space or you're providing incentives, but they do take a lot of your time, both in the development, the facilitation, the recruitment, things that we will be talking about. But we very much believe in a mixed method approach, which means using both quantitative and qualitative data. And we want to want to help you understand today why we think that there's a key role for you to be for focus groups and key informant interviews to be in your community. So surveys, just for those, I'm sure most of you know this, but surveys are great in their ability, if the sampling allows for it, to provide representative data of the entire school, for example, or your community. Certainly they can provide information on a broad basis. They typically answer questions of what, how much, how often, to what extent, and of course are excellent in that if done correctly, they provide anonymity to the respondent. So you typically know the group of people that you're surveying, but you don't know who said what. Focus groups are a fantastic opportunity for you to get more nuanced detail on complex issues or processes. They don't have to come after a survey if you're not doing a survey in your community, but often we use them to follow up on a survey, or where we think that there are certain issues and we want to talk to folks in the community about these. They typically answer the how or the why. So for example, in the prevention field, you might know that youth are drinking, and you might want to figure out why. Is it because they're very stressed out academically? Is it because they have nothing else to do in their town? Is it because alcohol is the easiest substance for them to access? And then we might also find out where in fact they're doing it. Sometimes we can get this information on a survey, but often we can find out in a focus group. Is it at the local park? Is it at people's houses? We can get some information that we might have a harder time getting on a survey. Okay, moving on. Nina's gonna advance the slide for me.
Try. Oh.
She's gonna try. Okay, great. So there's more benefits, as we're saying, they go beyond your survey data. You can further assess the needs, the gaps, the strength in your community. And most importantly, or very importantly, you can hear from stakeholders in their own words and voices. You can also learn about emerging issues. You can corroborate or validate local, state, or national surveyed data. It's not typically the appropriate time to use a focus group to refute data because it's only a smaller group of people, but we can certainly test our assumptions. So at this point, I was going to ask if people have an example of when they have used or decided to use focus groups in their community, or I know Kathy on the call, she can talk about a decision that she's made in Fairfield to use focus groups.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. So we were able to sort of break down our student survey that we did this past March, and we decided to go ahead, even amongst COVID, We were using the Search Institute's developmental relationship survey that fits nicely with the school's social emotional work that they're doing. So in breaking the substance use data down, we were able to look at different student populations, and lo and behold, our LGBTQ student population and our students with an IEP rose to the top in terms of the higher risk student populations, which fits with what research shows as well. So I reached out to the counselors of both Ludlow and Ward high schools, as well as talked to the social worker at Walter Fitzgerald School, which is Fairfield's alternative school, and talked to them about the idea of doing focus groups with LGBTQ. And everybody was excited about that. And our hope, our goal is to meet the needs of the school, the social workers, psychologists, the faculty advisors that work with the Gay Straight Alliance groups at these schools, as well as the coalition. So getting to that why, why are these students using more? And it's across the board. It's not just one substance over another, it's all substances. So we have our initial meeting with the group of counselors and faculty advisors on the 14th of December to just begin a conversation about what, hopefully we're going to draft some questions for our focus groups and then start planning from there as to when these focus groups would happen, which would definitely be after the holidays. But really excited that we're going to get into some of this data at a deeper level and hopefully be able to discover gaps, things that we can be doing in the community and in the schools to better address the needs of our LGBTQ population.
Awesome. Thank you for that example, Kathy. That was a great detailed example. And for those of you interested in hearing more about how that goes, Kathy, I'm sure after she's completed them, or you can reach out to me, we'll be happy to talk to you about that. So moving on to the next slide, focus groups.
Emily, I have a hand up here really quickly. If
Oh,
that's okay.
thank you.
Go ahead, Larry, if you want to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, briefly, can even if you use the example that she just used, could you just give me a little more information on qualitative and quantitative data?
Yeah, so we're going to be, so this is just the very first slide, so hopefully we're going to be going into that, but quantitative data really simply is typically your survey data, it's administrative data, it's data that's collected on a broader scale. And so qualitative, when we say qualitative data, what we're talking about are focus groups and key informant interviews. And we're going to go in now and we're going to define what focus groups and key informant interviews are. Is that what you're looking for?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Part of the way that, we know that everyone's kind of coming in with different levels of experience. So we jumped right into the process, and now we're going to be talking. So a focus group is a small group of people, typically 10 to 12, who usually share common traits, characteristics, and experiences. It's, if you're going to be looking in your community for a wide range, you might want to have, for instance, a group of folks who live in a certain neighborhood, a group of folks from a certain age, a group of folks, clearly if you have non-English speakers, you would want to have, a group of Spanish speakers together, folks that, that you can facilitate a level of comfort and a good conversation with. So you assemble these folks and you have a guided, structured conversation, ideally on a particular topic, although that topic, if it's, for example, substance use in the community, might cover specific different things, different types of substances or access, et cetera. So the purpose of a focus group really specifically is to draw upon participants or your folks that are in the room's attitudes, feelings, beliefs, experience in a way that's typically not feasible using other methods. What's great about a focus group is people, react to what each other is saying. It can help to bring people out that might not otherwise speak. We certainly encourage people to agree and to disagree with what they hear, so we can hear a range of perspectives. So it's a great way of generating ideas, identifying problems. If you have a messaging, for example, we've used focus groups a lot in prevention to ask youth, for example, does this slogan resonate with you? What do you think is best? Typically when it's a group of adults sitting around the room, they may come up with something completely different than when you bring a group of youth together to talk to them about what's happening in their community and what messages resonate. So again, we use it to better understand the challenges that our communities face, to test our assumptions, and to create initial change ideas, and to react to strategies or interventions that we have in the community to see if they're working. Key informant interviews, we're not going to talk as much about them today, but really, really basically, that's when you might be talking to one other person at a time. So it's an in-depth interview, typically with a stakeholder, a person that knows what's going on in the community. So for example, you might talk to the police chief or a school superintendent, and they might want more anonymity than could be afforded if they were in a room with other people in the community. So it's typically people that have firsthand knowledge and an informed perspective or a specific interest in that topic. You might hold a focus group with members of your coalition who come from different sectors to find out different information in terms of what they can offer. It may be a little bit less structured, but we definitely recommend that you have a core set of questions that you're going to ask, and then be open. In all of these situations, you need to be open and flexible to go where the conversation goes, at the same time not be derailed if people are going off topic. So again, key informant interviews build on, I'm going to be using focus groups a lot today in the language, but know that key informant interviews typically follow the same guidance. Again, they build on a participant's knowledge or expertise. They also can importantly lead to other stakeholders. Typically in a focus group, we might in a focus group ask people, who else should we talk to? But typically in a key informant interview, we will say, who else might you suggest that we talk to? And it's usually a great way to become connected to other people in your community. And again, just in terms of feasibility, it's much easier to conduct. And so if you don't have a lot of experience with either of these types of activities, you may want to start getting more comfortable doing a key informant interview, which you can more easily hold on the phone or via Zoom or in person. And then as you get more comfortable, you can, and typically also key informant interviews are fine to do with just yourself and one other person. Whereas for a focus group, we recommend that you have a note taker in the room or on the Zoom with you as well. Larry, does that answer your question? We're going to go now into which one might I choose to do, but does anyone?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. And I see that there are some questions in the chat. And so after I'm done with this slide, if somebody else if Jen or Nina, if not you, or Jen, if you want to look at the chat questions and see if I should take a pause and answer them. But in terms of deciding what to do, I've mentioned some of the issues. Again, key informant interviews are best when you're wanting to interview one person because of a sensitive topic. Also, I mentioned, specific stakeholders, but I didn't mention that there's sometimes kids or youth that might feel pressure to conform. And so in terms of social desirability or peer pressure, sometimes it's better to talk to youth. I will say that Nina and I both have experience talking about sensitive issues that you might not think would go well in a focus group, but most of the time they do go well. I've rarely, if ever, been in a focus group, even when asking, quote unquote, sensitive questions, where people who show up aren't willing to talk honestly about those. Maybe not everybody in the room, but we've, get really good conversation, and people are also really appreciative that we've taken the time to hear from them. People want to be heard. And so focus groups, again, they promote discussion between participants. They yield interaction. Again, you know, we hear about, you know, parents might say, oh yeah, I let my teenagers drink in my basement because it's safer than them driving. And someone else might say, oh yeah, I do that too, or my neighbors do that too. When, you know, so you get a better sense of kind of the spread of a community norm or the presence of a community norm. And I think, again, I've mentioned these other points. So now I'll just take a little bit of a break. Do people have any questions about?
Yep. Emily, one question is it okay to note take or record during focus group with permission from the group members?
Yeah, and we're going to get into some of those nuts and bolts, and we are definitely going to be talking about that.
All right. And the other one was for multicultural groups, how do we maintain consistency with multiple experiences related to disabilities and marginalized groups? So that might be something you're covering later as well.
We want to make sure that we're, you know, talking about equity throughout this conversation. So I'll just make a point to say that, again, if you're, you know, it's hard to have a group with folks from, you know, many different languages. You need to have a good translator. It's best, if possible, to have, you know, a like language group where you would have a fluent facilitator. I've certainly done groups where, you know, if it's a number of groups, one was done with the same protocol, which we'll talk about what a protocol is, but the same set of questions translated, you know, given in Spanish and then translated. And then in terms of disability, which we'll touch on more, we do want to think about the logistics of, you know, who can access it, whether it's because of children and the time of day or people work, to think about when and where you hold focus groups. And, you know, Nina and I were thrown into the world of needing to do several via focus groups via Zoom this past year, which we had never done before, and actually found that they are a great way of minimizing some of those access barriers.
And then Colette, your question about written parental permission. Yes, we're going to cover that, but the short answer is yes, you would need parent permission, but we'll get into more detail on that.
Okay. So moving to the next slide. Okay, so perfect. We want to talk about equity issues again throughout, and the cultural competence both of the facilitator and the note taker. Again, we want to make sure that you meet the needs of the diverse needs of your community members. So focus groups, as you know, Kathy gave the example of, you know, it's a great time to reach out to members, for example, of the LGBTQ community. Nina and I last year reached out to both youth as well as parents of LGBTQ youth when we were doing when we were facilitating statewide youth substance use focus groups. Again, reducing participation barriers, providing food, dinner. I've heard of actually for Zoom now providing a gift card of dinner, or you can just provide a gift card. There are ways in which you can drop a link into the chat and people can sign up, and you can record their participation and then send them a Zoom link or send them an electronic gift card. That is a great way of getting people to come, as well as a great way of thanking people and compensating them for their time. And again, strategies, all of these strategies don't work for everyone. It's great to ask people in the community what works best for you versus time, what works best for you versus what kind of incentives would you want. We are not advocating a one size fits all approach, but we want to make sure that, you know, people are not thinking that this is a cookie cutter approach, but that they're, you know, taking into consideration the needs of being as inclusive, the needs of everyone in the community, and being as inclusive as possible.
And I can add an example to that. There was a group I was running, a focus group with a several teens, and they attended an LGBTQ support group. And they couldn't do it virtually through Zoom. So I ended up going down to meet with them in person, but the reason why they couldn't was because of the privacy issues of them jumping onto a Zoom meeting at home. They all would have been at home. It was during sort of the height of COVID last year, and they didn't have that privacy at home that they needed. And for some of these kids, they actually weren't out to their parents about their sexual orientation. So it just wasn't possible. And so you have to think through those types of things. Another situation that came up with this big project that we did was to share with you an oversight on our part was we didn't build in to the beginning of our planning the need for a bilingual facilitator. So we definitely came across that issue as we started digging into the work, but really waited until we had already started conducting these groups and kind of had to scramble to find someone. And in hindsight, that really should have been one of our, original key considerations as we started the project. So lessons learned are always important to look at as well.
So when you're dealing with teenagers, youth, is there, could you possibly be liable for dealing with minors in a focus group?
You need parent permission. So the parents had given permission for them to attend this group. But it wasn't a conversation they would have been comfortable having with me talking about substance use and mental health. So you really want to, and we are going to, as I said, we will get into sort of the nuts and bolts on parent consent, but it's always recommended you get parent consent for anybody under the age of 18. And you actually give them in the consent, you describe the content of the focus group and what topics you're going to be covering. So they have an understanding of that.
And just to further, when we distribute the PowerPoint presentation to you after today, at the end of the slideshow will be some samples and examples, resources for you, including some sample consent language that you could send out. We don't recommend that you send out the specific questions really to anyone, except for if there's an institution that would require it for consent. But as Nina was saying, you definitely need consent of your under 18 folks, and you might be working in conjunction with an organization that needs it for adults too. And we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. I see there's a few hands up.
Yeah, Elke, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Well, it wasn't a question. It was more of a statement for the gentleman that just asked in regards to the youth. So I'm hoping to do a focus group with youth within the next 2 weeks. So I did provide a permission slip, but I also contacted the parents because a lot of the parents of the youth are non-English speaking, and just to also have that verbal communication about not only what I do, but some of the goals of the focus group. And it really helped having that conversation with the parents, because sometimes even with the permission slips, there could be challenges with reading and writing. So I also wanted to make sure that I could follow through verbally so they could hear my voice and they could understand a little bit more. So that may be an option as well.
And that's a great point. One of the things we're going to talk about is making sure when you are writing your questions that you think about the receptive language. And I also see someone mentions about translating, and with a focus group, you don't just use a translator, you use a facilitator who's fluent in the language of your participant. So ideally, I see that there's over 10 dialects in Spanish alone. And so again, it may be a resource issue where you can't find somebody that's a perfect match, but we certainly wouldn't conduct a focus group with Spanish speakers or speakers of another language unless the facilitator was fluent in that language. Elke, do you have a question?
I think that's from before. Anybody else?
Erica did.
Hi, yes, I guess I just wanted to clarify and maybe understand, obviously, since the parents have to give consent and they have to sign off on the forms and they're aware of the questions, and using the example that you provided where the students weren't feeling comfortable at home because of the topics being discussed because they weren't out to their parents, would their parents have known those since they signed the form, or how does that work?
The parents know they're going to a group, that they don't necessarily know why that it's an LGBTQ group. So that was just the issue, was that I was specifically wanted to sort of make sure they felt comfortable talking about their experiences as an LGBTQ youth. It wasn't the issue of them talking about mental health or substance use from my perspective. It was that they weren't going to be able to be fully honest at home if that came up in conversation. Does that
Oh,
make
Yeah,
sense?
but yes, the parents knew they were talking about substance abuse and mental
Yes.
health issues. So
Yes,
the
it was
parents-
more that they were coming from a place where there wasn't, I didn't know for individual circumstances, but they weren't necessarily, I didn't want to put them in a position where another student or youth might have said something where, it caused an issue at home. So they were aware of the topics. It was just that they were in a space where they might not be able to talk about their experiences as an LGBTQ youth.
I understand. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
And I see a comment about reaching out to groups that are already existing in the community. And yes, absolutely. We definitely recommend that when you're thinking about, the how-to of setting up a focus group, it's great to link into groups that might already be meeting for another reason. And so you can, take over that meeting with their permission, of course, or, look to them to recruit interested members of their organization to participate.
Yeah, and we'll get into that. And again, we'll reiterate that, but that's a great point. So just a list here, we've kind of covered a lot of this, but I think as I said, it's really important to think about who you want to participate in these groups. Are you considering gender? Do you need to consider race and ethnicity, language, and really work through that. Access issues, transportation. I would, recommend in some cases you want to prepare to have a focus group in an area that's accessible by near public transportation. If you might be doing something in a city where there are people who don't have access to cars. I ran a focus group several years ago. I would use the local YMCA and I would be able to support the parents with young children by using 2 of the staff as babysitters while I ran the group. So things like that, if you can work through some of those issues, it's really going to enhance the participants that, are able to make it. As Emily said, one of the benefits to doing these groups virtually is that it reduces some of those access issues, which is wonderful. But we don't want to, solely rely on that, because the in-person groups are also, a wonderful direction to go. So just switching gears for a minute. I know that this is not something that all of you will be familiar with. This is the strategic prevention framework. This is something that in the prevention field we use as a model to guide our work. It's 5 steps, it's cyclical. You constantly working with assessment, capacity building, planning, implementation, and evaluation. Because we are being sponsored by folks in the prevention field, we really wanted to make sure we mention this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if it's something you're interested in learning more about, I have put some resources in the slides at the end of this PowerPoint, and you can certainly access a wealth of information on the strategic prevention framework. It's actually a great model for many, many different things to use. But, basically, when you're thinking about this in the work that you do, if you use this model, this type of data collection, these focus groups and key informant interviews can play a really big role in the data that you collect. If you're thinking about that assessment field, that's really a process where you're gathering information to better understand your community. Maybe you're trying to understand a problem in your community. You're also looking at what resources there are in your community, what the needs are in your community. And this is all information that you could get through focus group and key informant interviews. And it's a great way to do it. You will also see sometimes the use of key informant interviews and focus groups in your evaluation phase. You might have implemented a program and you want to look at how that program is doing. So you're collecting information and you're analyzing it and you're using the outcomes of that information to possibly modify the program based on what you've heard, or maybe you need to, completely change the program because you've got some great feedback from folks who were involved in that. So you really do see this qualitative data. So we've talked about that as a really great way to supplement and support any quantitative data you might use in the evaluation phase of that SPIF model. Any questions before we jump on about the SPIF model? As I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but I really just wanted folks to see that this does really fit in well.
No questions right now, Nina, if you want to go ahead.
All right, so nuts and bolts. So you guys have been great because you're already asking all the right questions. The nuts and bolts of conducting a focus group. The first thing is your capacity. What staff do you have? Is this something you're going to be doing on your own? Does anybody in the organization or the community that you work have experience in focus groups that you could work with? I would encourage anybody to have their staff jump in on trainings like this one. We have some resources at the end of this PowerPoint about conducting that you can also use. But really the best way is to do. And I would say the best way, as Emily said earlier, is to start with some key informant interviews. It's going to give you that experience in setting up your questions, building the template you're going to use, talking one-on-one with a key stakeholder in your community, and then, practice summarizing notes and all those steps. That's a really great way to start. From there, I would say jump into doing a focus group. Ask if you can be a note taker in a focus group. Maybe somebody is doing one and you could sit in and you could be the person who's going to support the facilitator. That's how I started. I think that's how Emily started. And that really is a great way to learn. You just have to jump in. Approval. So Emily briefly mentioned this, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I did want folks to know that occasionally you will run across a situation where you may need to go through an institutional review board or some other approval process. And that's basically going to happen when the organization you're working with has that. So sometimes you might hear this being referred to as an IRB. You're going to follow their protocol. So they have a board of folks whose job it is to review research projects, and they will have some documents you would need to fill out, basically explaining what you were doing, briefly detailing what you were going to be asking about, and you would basically get approved or not approved, and you would have to go from there. I really don't think many folks are going to run into this issue. I've only ever run across it when I've worked with colleges and universities, and that was more on a survey level. So I was trying to implement a survey tool that needed to be approved, but certainly want everybody to be familiar with this in case they run across it. Recruitment. We are going to go into recruitment in a bit, so just hold off there. A lot of details on recruitment. Consent. We've already spent a little bit of time talking about this, but it's important to reiterate that you will want to get parent consent from anybody under 18 who's participating. I recommend when you're doing youth focus groups that you work with an existing organization. So whether it's a Boys and Girls Club or a faith-based youth group or an after-school club at a high school or a middle school, and you make sure you're following their procedures and consent, because often they will have them if they're a formal organization. If they don't, as Emily said, we've included some example language you could use in a youth consent form at the end of these slides. Feel free to, borrow that, but you really just want to make sure that the parents understand when it's happening, where it's happening, what they're going to be talking about. And then if there's any incentives, you'd want to make sure they approved of that. Typically with youth, I've only ever done food for incentives. But recently we did do a big project where the youth were able to earn an electronic gift card. So that's certainly something you would want to include in that consent form as well. And then logistics, data analysis, and the dissemination are all things we're going to cover towards the end of this. So I'm just going to move ahead and dig into recruitment. Who is going to be included in the focus group? From experience, we found that if you're doing a focus group virtually, you really want to keep your numbers on the small side. Anywhere from 6 to 10 people is a great size. We've done smaller and we've done bigger, and it works. But we would say optimally, we want that 6 to 10. If you're doing a group in person, you have a little bit more room. You could definitely do more like 10 to 12, and that seems to work well. But I would say definitely no more than 12. It just gets too hard to hear from everybody when you have that many people in a room. You want to recruit people who are going to give you the insight you're looking for. So you want to, if there's an issue you want to try and understand in the community where you are, let's say there's some sort of housing issue and you live in Norwalk or you're working in Norwalk, you're not going to do a focus group with people in Danbury. You want to recruit from the community where you're trying to understand the problems or the issues. You don't want to create a situation where the participants might feel hindered by someone else in the group. So I would never recommend doing a focus group with both youth and their parents, because I don't think the parents are going to be as comfortable speaking truthfully, and I don't think the youth are. So you want to really think about those dynamics. Another dynamic that can be tough is if you're running a group of youth. This actually happened to us, and their supervisor wanted to jump in. And we just said they couldn't, and they were very upset by that. But we said, we want these youth to be really kind of be able to feel like they can speak to us truthfully and openly, and they might hold back because they know you and they don't have that relationship with us. And, I think that's just the same with any group that you're doing. You really don't want any kind of supervisor situation where somebody might feel less open to speaking truthfully. And then, as we've mentioned, think about those subpopulations. That's always really important in terms of your equity. Are you representing, are you getting that representation that you really want to sort of address the issues you're trying to uncover? And then how many focus groups? So there's no hard or fast rule about this. Often, sometimes it just comes down to a capacity issue. It's typically not great to just do one focus group. You really want to try to do several if you can. Sometimes, for example, if there's a situation where you were trying to get information on an after-school program that was being proposed, you would not just want to talk to the parents, you would want to talk to people at the school who might be running the program, and you want to talk to the youth themselves about that program. So you'd really want those 3 perspectives, which could turn out to be 6 focus groups. We'll also say, Emily and I kind of talked about this, we don't want folks to think that they shouldn't start if they can't do as many as they would like. If you end up doing one and you only get to do one, go forward and do it. Don't hinder yourself by the fact that you can't do as many as you'd like, because that information is still going to be really useful to you in your assessments, your evaluation, whatever you're using it for. And, obviously just try to get people to participate who you don't typically hear from. And that's, obvious why that's important, but it's good to mention, I think. So some recruitment techniques and tips, you always want to recruit more folks than you actually need because oftentimes people drop out. Incentives are a great way to get people in the door. If I ever do in-person focus groups, I always have food provided, whether it's a full meal or a breakfast or a lunch, whatever it is, you definitely want to try to bring that food if you can. As we've mentioned, gift cards are also a great way to incentivize folks. And if you're doing these virtual focus groups, as Emily said, it's really easy to drop a document in the chat at the end that they can fill out a separate Google form. And that way you can send the gift cards to them through the email that they've given you, but their name isn't attached to the focus group in any way. Think about timing. Where is this going to happen? As I said, really think about equity when you're selecting your location, the time of day. You don't want to just assume that these daytime focus groups are going to work for folks. If you have working parents, you want to offer an evening session. You might even want to consider a Saturday session and provide babysitting. So those things are really important to consider. The best way to recruit is through your connections, whether it's somebody you work with, whether it's another organization, as we mentioned, for youth. Partnering with those existing organizations and groups is the best way. But in general, people really want to share their experiences and their knowledge. And I think they appreciate being included and asked about these things when it's something they care about or they're, concerned about or passionate about. So use your connections. Don't think that that's not going to get you where it will. You'll definitely get people in the room that way. And then don't assume that people remember. Very simple. Really make sure you send out those reminders, texts, phone calls, emails, whatever it is, but you really want to make sure you cover those simple logistical things, but they can make a big difference for folks. Any questions just in general on the recruitment piece of this topic before we move on? All right.
Okay, now we're going to talk about developing your protocol. What's a protocol? Your protocol is everything you're going to cover during your focus group. So again, it is your directions, your questions, your notes to yourself, but also all of the kind of details. So it's a welcome or introduction that states the purpose of the focus group, how the data will be used, which is really important. People, want to know, why are you doing this? Who's going to be using it? What the confidentiality considerations are. Again, we've talked a lot about informed consent. I'm not going to talk about that now. It's important for the facilitator and the note taker in the room, who are probably unknown to the group, to let people know who they are. Ground rules, we've talked about that. The demographic questionnaire can be dropped in. We've talked about that. Then we go into focus group questions, and we're going to be spending several minutes talking about some tips around developing your questions, and then the thank yous as well. So in terms of, go ahead. So what do you want to know? First, you want to develop your list of questions. So you want to, ideally, you have about an hour with folks. You want to hone in on a specific area. You don't want to be too broad, and you also don't want to let your focus be derailed. Yes, you will probably find that there's somebody in the group that has an agenda that may not be on the topic that you want to be talking about. You really have to, not be shy with keeping it focused. The best thing also to do is to pilot or test your questions with a sample or an individual. So if it's a youth, for example, ask them your questions. Do these make sense? Is the level of language appropriate? Are you not using acronyms? Do people understand what you're trying to say? Really, for an hour, 8 to 10 questions typically is all you're going to get through. Okay, so the other thing, and we kind of said this in terms of icebreakers, you can either do an icebreaker, you should do an icebreaker, but then you should also do a warm-up question, which is kind of an easier way of saying, why are you here? Who are you? Why was it important for you to come today? It's important to set the tone to make people feel comfortable in the room. And I'm going to be reading through these pretty quickly because we have a lot to cover. And again, if anyone has any questions kind of as I'm going through these, please raise your hands. And then we'll conclude with a wrap-up question that hopefully brings the discussion back to the central themes or ideas and asks people to kind of reflect on what was said and make sure that everyone who wants to has had a chance to contribute to the conversation. So as I mentioned, it's really important. Hopefully you'll have a small enough group of people that everyone can kind of introduce themselves. You'll see these people wrote their full names, but if you're doing a focus group, you may want to, virtual focus group, you may want to just ask people to just change their Zoom name to their first name for confidentiality. That's fine, but you do kind of need to know their name so that you can call on people. For parents, we typically ask them how old their children are, what grade they're in, how long they've been in the community. For other stakeholders, you know, if it's unknown, you know, what is your role in the community or who do you work for? And again, you know, why did you show up today? In terms of knowledge and expertise, again, because we know many of you work in the prevention field, we want to talk about, you know, we want to have an intro that is, you know, fairly broad and conversational. Let's talk about youth use of alcohol and access to alcohol in your community. And then if you're talking to peers, you can ask them, you know, questions about, you know, has it become easier, the same, more difficult? Where are you getting alcohol? And then we ask them for probes. So maybe they've said, oh, you know, maybe they haven't said anything, and you can say, oh, are you getting it from home? It's best to kind of have an open-ended question first, but certainly have probes at your, again, you haven't distributed these questions beforehand. These are for you, and you can have these probes so that you can help to facilitate conversation if people aren't forthcoming with specific answers. Again, we want to have probes, but we also want to make sure that we're not leading people in a specific direction, that we're providing the space for people to, you know, provide examples that they're familiar with. So I'm just mentioning the probe. So probe, again, it's important to define what you're saying. So probe is a question or statement which encourages participants to add to or elaborate on something which was said. So you saw some examples. Again, it allows for more specific responses. Tell me more about that. Would you give me an example of what you mean? Does anyone else feel that way or differently? Or you can also, you know, be more specific. So if you're asking a question about vaping, you can ask, okay, well, you said your friends vape. What substances are they typically vaping? So you should have some broad examples and then some specific examples at your disposal. Any questions about that? So I don't think so. Okay. So we're moving on now to, and Kathy gave an example of this. How do I include follow-up questions in my focus group from my survey data or from other data that I have? So here's an example. We could say to people in focus group, in our student survey, we asked students about how they were feeling. A large number of students reported feeling anxious, lonely, and depressed. And then we ask, you know, either that group of students or that hopefully or potentially parents, does that resonate with you? What are some of the drivers behind why students, you know, may be feeling this way? So it's a good way to validate or corroborate your information. We can also ask students about, you know, if we're asking them about alcohol use or about specific grade use, we can say, you know, what factors might be contributing to the higher rates of alcohol in this community, or what factors might contribute to the grade specific responses that we're seeing. And again, people might, you know, refute this information, but ideally your student survey was done in a way that it's representative of your community. So even if the information from the focus group doesn't necessarily validate this information, it's still important to understand it in context. But you also wouldn't ask, for example, a group in 11th and 12th graders information about 9th and 10th graders. You would ask them about information among themselves and their peers. And similarly for parents of high schoolers, you wouldn't ask them questions, or you wouldn't look to them to answer questions about the middle school population, or unless they of course had middle school children as well. And again, it's incredibly important, and we always want you to be thinking about equity when developing your questions, to make sure that you're not assuming that the answers to your questions are uniform throughout your community, but there may be specific groups or subgroups dependent on a variety of different factors that have a different answer to this. And ideally you're asking people of those communities, but if you're not, if you're only doing one, you can certainly ask people, is it, in your experience, do you have a sense of whether or not this is affecting other groups in your community differently than others? What makes a good question? Again, we've mentioned many of these things. You have to think about the participants' level of their receptive language, avoid using acronyms. That's really hard for a lot of us who work in specific fields where we say things like SPIF and other acronyms all the time. But you want to use neutral language. You want to sound conversational and natural, if at all possible. You want to have a short question. You don't want to ask people about 7 things in one question, but you want those questions to be open-ended. You don't want to ask people a question that they can answer with yes or no, and then the conversation doesn't flow from there. And again, ideally, your questions are based on what you think the participants know, and certainly on their perspective and their feelings about the issue. And again, common pitfalls to avoid are yes, no, true, false questions. Those are types of questions you might typically see on a survey that make more sense for there. Leading questions, since most of the kids in the week drink in this town, how often do you and your friends drink? That certainly is putting a lot of bias into your question. And again, as I've mentioned, don't allow participants to derail your conversation to their specific interest. Don't be shy in thanking people for their comments, but asking to move on so that you hear from others in the group. Any questions before we get into a little bit of a group activity around questions?
I think you're good.
Okay, so we're gonna have a little activity time, and if we had had a smaller group, we would break out, but since we have a big group and not as many facilitators today, we're gonna do this together. And you can either raise your hand or you can put your comments in the chat as we go along. So here's a question. In what park do most underclassmen gather to drink during the weekend? Anyone see any problems with that question? Is it perfectly worded? Is it not? Anyone want to take a stab at rewriting that, rephrasing it?
Larry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say that it assumes that all of the underclassmen drink.
Exactly. Elke?
Yeah, well, first, I think it can be somewhat of a close-ended question, but as the gentleman just stated, yeah, it makes an assumption about alcohol use.
Exactly. Okay. So right, there's an assumption that most people are doing it, and there's also an assumption that people are in fact gathering in the park to drink. So there's 2 assumptions in there. A better wording might be, for those students that drink, are there common gathering locations in town? Are there out of town locations? And then are these gatherings typically high school students of all ages, upperclassmen? So you're trying to understand without assuming students drink or where they're drinking. Do students in this town vape? What might be the problem with that question?
Once again, I think just for me, I'm just thinking in regards to gathering information. I always think about close-ended and open-ended questions. So maybe reframing that question as to like a what, how, or when.
Exactly.
Just my opinion.
Yeah, that's what we want, and you're exactly right. So yes, it may not elicit the details necessary to identify or address the issue. And this is, for those of you that are doing surveys, don't re-ask survey questions, but think about ways of getting more nuanced information. So maybe you already know that students are vaping, but you want to find out more about, why they're vaping or what they're vaping or where they're vaping. So how much, to what extent, if there's been a change, why has there been a change? All those things that I just said. Okay, one more.
Yeah, we have one more. We'll just go through it quickly.
Okay, so is allowing your high school students to practice drinking at your home a good idea? This could be a yes, no question. A better wording might be an open-ended one to have a conversation around community norms, better understanding of their respondents' feelings or issues. Such as, here's an example, how do you feel about allowing your high school student to practice drinking at your home? To what extent has there been education to date around the effects of alcohol in the adolescent brain? And we put that there because that's typically a conversation that we have with parents that we're not necessarily able to elicit for a survey, but it's a great focus group conversation to have.
So Emily, just so you know, it's 11:07, so I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I've gone through most of this, but this is really just covering some of the logistics around conducting a focus group. The one thing we haven't really discussed before is the space that you're using. If you're doing something in person, just consider the way you set up the room. Your best option is a circle style. You don't want anybody feeling like they're in the back or in a seat where they can't see everybody. Make sure you're putting signs up so people know where to go when they show up. That seems like a small thing, but that can be a really huge deterrent for people. I think we've talked about the time. We've talked about recording, but I'm going to mention it here again. If you are doing a focus group through a Zoom, you've already got a recording feature. And as a participant, you have to agree that you're being recorded. So that's been a new, a feature that's actually helpful. If you're not using Zoom, you need to make sure you let people know that you're recording the focus group. If you're doing the focus group in person, it is critical that you bring a recorder. Some people do use their phones. My phone never seems to have enough storage. I bring a separate recorder. I bring extra batteries. I test it before I start. And really what that's going to be used for is so the note taker can go back if there was anything that they missed or that they need to clarify when they're writing up their notes. And that's all it is. And you can, let people know that that's why you're recording it. It's not something you're going to be broadcasting to the public. We've talked about food. We've talked about incentives. Those are all some of the logistics to consider. Your team, as we've mentioned several times, you really need 2 people at a minimum when you're doing focus groups. You need the facilitator and you need a note taker. And the note taker is primarily there to record and observe what's been said, but they also play a really key role in following up sometimes with questions that the facilitator might have missed. So maybe some of those follow-up questions, they can certainly interject at any point. They can help elicit responses from people who may be quiet. So this has happened to Emily and I many times where she's facilitating and I'm taking the notes and I'm able to say, Ryan, we haven't really heard from you. Is there anything you'd like to add or is there anything you'd like to say? Now, maybe Ryan doesn't have anything and he can just politely decline, but sometimes people need that little push, that little kind of invitation to participate, and that's perfectly okay to do. You just need to prompt people along. So those 2 positions, the team you're going to use, it's really critical that you have 2 people. Clearly define those roles ahead of time. Who's dropping the survey in the chat? Who's doing, who's taking care of what? Moving forward, as you would start any meeting, you're going to start your focus group with a very basic introduction of who you are and why you're there and what you plan on doing. And you want to be really clear. You want to have that written down as part of your protocol. So you're going to actually have a script. You can read it or you can just learn it and speak it, but you want people to know what the expectation is of that session during that time. And again, as we did at the start of this meeting, when you do your focus group, you really need to establish your ground rules. It's very, very important that people know that their participation is voluntary. And you're going to actually have your ground rules as part of your protocol as well. So this is actually from a focus group that we've done. And we would say at this time, I want to set some ground rules. Everybody's opinion is important. We want to respect what everybody has to say. I want to make sure everybody gets a chance to speak and that we cover all the topics today. You can choose not to respond. So you really want to make sure all of that is verbally said to the group, and you want to get an agreement, whether it's a thumbs up if you're doing a Zoom or not, heads nodding if you're in person. You can also have your ground rules written down for folks on the survey and they can read them. And you can also put them in the chat if you're doing this virtually, but it's really important that folks know what those expectations are. Consent and confidentiality are two of the biggest issues you want to make sure you've covered. So we've talked a lot about this consent. If you're doing a youth focus group, you do want parent consent. You need that to be a written document. If you're doing an in-person focus group, ask folks for permission to record. And then when we do suggest when you're doing virtual focus groups, you have people just use their first names because you don't need to know their last names. And also, you could encourage people to include their preferred pronouns in the name on their little tile if you're doing a Zoom. That's also another equity issue. And finally, when I do in-person focus groups, I actually bring name tags so I know people's first names. So I actually have them write their first names down just because to set the tone and really make it more of an informal discussion. It's nice to be able to talk to people and address them personally. So the next couple of slides are just some do's and don'ts. As we've said, you really want to focus on who is talking and who is not, and make sure that everybody's had an opportunity to talk. And that's something your note taker can help you with. They can kind of prompt people who may be quiet. You as the facilitator, after something's been said, you can ask if anybody else has a different perspective that they want to share. You can try and use a round robin format if you're able to, where everybody kind of gets an opportunity to weigh in on a topic. Creating those opportunities for everybody to speak is really a really critical part of this. And then treat the participants as the experts. You might have heard what they've said 20 times, but it still needs to be something that you're really interested in hearing. And, stay impartial and non-judgmental. That's key. Switching gears just a little bit, because Emily and I wanted to make sure we covered this. Just make sure when you're done that you think about what the lessons are that you learned. And this isn't anything that you do, but think about the questions you asked, how things went, the process, what worked well, maybe what didn't, what you need to change. I can tell you from experience, when I've done focus groups, I often have to go back and modify my protocol after I've done one, because you definitely realize sometimes the order might not be the way you want it, or you need to add some prompts to some questions, or just, it wasn't exactly the right way. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly fine. Give yourself that opportunity to go back and think about those lessons learned. And use this reflective listening, really trying to understand what the speaker's ideas are and offer that idea back to them so that you can confirm it's being understood correctly. The benefits of that are that you can check the accuracy. They might offer more detail if you haven't given it back to them in the way that they expected it to be interpreted, and you can summarize agreements and disagreements. So this reflective listening is a really great tool when you're doing these focus groups. Some don'ts. I'm actually not going to read these because of time, but I will just leave this up for a minute. Very simple don'ts. Don't finish sentences, domination of conversation, don't challenge, don't argue, all those things that we've kind of said. You really want to be careful not to do any of that. Similar to any meeting you would hold, you would, all of these would be the same.
Okay.
So Emily, we have about 15 minutes.
Okay. Any questions about facilitation before we move on to talking about what you do once you've taken your notes? Okay. So you've had your focus groups, and you may have used a note taker, and you may have used a Zoom transcription service. We don't recommend that you necessarily pay for a transcription service, but they do exist if you feel like you need that level of detail. So the note taker reviews and cleans up their work, trying to keep the original language of the speaker where possible, or if they're going to summarize, make sure that they're not misrepresenting what was heard. And then you're going to begin by analyzing your data, uncovering and highlighting general and specific themes through a process that we're going to call iterative coding, and we're going to talk about that. And again, I just want to say we could spend an hour and a half or longer on how to code effectively. We just want to give you, in the remaining time that we have, a little bit of an idea about what we do to kind of show you the level of detail that we put into understanding the information that we gather during the focus group. So qualitative data analysis, remember, is a process of examining and interpreting qualitative data, understand what it represents. We want to, given that we want to minimize the bias, we all are biased, and we want to minimize that. The key way of doing that is not to interpret findings by yourself. Again, you have a team, hopefully, of the interviewer and the note taker. You may have a larger team. Maybe some people have done focus groups. There's 2 people that have done it in this area and 2 people have done it in the other area. You come together to look at what your common themes are, what can be learned from what was said, what can be learned from what wasn't said. So coding, again, qualitative data analysis is a rigorous and systematic approach to understanding the data that you've collected. So we're going to talk really briefly really, about developing a data dictionary. But a data dictionary are simply codes that we use, shorthand for understanding the themes and content of our work. We go through our report, and we either use a highlighter or paper, if we're doing pen and paper, or we can use a highlighter in the Word function, highlighting key text, and then going back. It's an iterative process, as I mentioned. So you're going back and you're looking at the themes that you've highlighted, both yourself as you go through each focus group, if there's multiple, and then also as you identify codes and key themes, somebody else is also looking at them, and you are ensuring that you agree, or in areas where you disagree, that you've discussed why your interpretation of the text might lead to a different coding. So just logistically, and we'll show you an example of this, we often, if we're doing it in Word, we'll highlight and then we'll put the code to the side in a comment box. We also highlight specific quotes that we want to pull out. For all of you who have ever read a report, it's always much more fun to hear or see a quote from an actual participant in their own words than just the interpretation of the researcher. And again, we can't say this enough, you have to use at least 2 coders and be open to reviewing and adjusting your coding schema. So here's an example. You don't have to worry about what we chose. It's not rocket science, but we when we were doing several youth focus groups and parent focus groups based on work looking at youth substance use and mental health. These are some of the codes that we came up with. It's just a shorthand way of us being able to identify what we thought were going to be important issues to pull out later on. So here is an example of a coding dictionary. And when we did this, I think I was the initial coder. I went through and created them. Nina went through and created more. And then the ways in which we applied those codes were also varied, and we needed to make sure that we were talk through and aligned our use of those codes throughout.
So Emily, I'm just going to go to the next slide because I don't think we have time for the,
Okay.
yeah.
So we're going to skip our examples. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So we had an example, a coding example that was basically some of this text without the codes. But what you can see here is, on the right side, you can see that I've dropped in codes. If you were to highlight specific words, you could see, but I think if you see in pink right there, there might be multiple codes. So it might be youth access to alcohol, youth, what people are drinking, peer norm. You can see that we've crossed out CNA, which was community norms, and changed that to peer norms. You might even add some bullets of, that if your codes aren't, if there's something that you want to highlight that your code itself doesn't allow you to do. You can see under Nina's box that she's a quote there that she thinks might be important. Again, it's an iterative process. So you go through this, you do this, you highlight what's important, and then you go through it again, and then you're going to pull these codes out and pull these main themes out as part of your summary. Any questions about, I know it's a lot to process quickly. Again, you can literally use a highlighter, or you can use in Word the highlighting function.
No questions. All right.
Okay. So once you've coded your themes, you're going to summarize. You're going to ask yourself again, what are participants telling you? Based on the information, you need to go back to your purpose of your focus group. You might see things that align with your purpose. You might also find information that you weren't initially looking for, and that's really important. We went into a focus group, for example, thinking we were mostly going to talk about substance use, and found out that there was a lot of mental health issues and concerns that we felt were really important that needed to be provided back to our funders and to the community. So you need to, while you want to be focused on your initial purpose, you need to be open to extraneous information as well. You need to consider, if you're doing a lot of focus groups or just looking at the number of different respondents, consider the frequency and the magnitude of responses. And again, pull out quotes to support your themes. So then the question is, okay, what do you do now when you have a summary? How do you turn this into actionable information, which is the most important thing? And again, we could be spending a lot more time on this, and maybe in the future we will be able to work through this more specifically. But the idea being is that you have a summary and you have summary findings. So here's an example of a report that we did, that we found these bulleted information is data that we found through looking at many focus groups. And then the summary findings here in terms of there being a clear need when considering the intermediate and long-term mental health supports, kids were looking for appropriate mental health therapy. They didn't feel that school counseling, for example, was where they could get that. Parents were concerned about finding the right fit mental health providers. Youth were identifying their concern about stigma. And then the recommendations that we put forward based on this finding were that were integrated into the report were to perhaps do some community and school-based campaigns to destigmatize the utilization of mental health services, publicize available resources for finding mental health supports in the community, providing information to parents, and then developing additional teen supports. So the reader can see in our report the data, the qualitative data, the summary, they can see the findings, our interpretation or analysis of the findings, and then the recommendations that flowed out of the focus groups that we had done. Any questions before we move on to, I think, our last slide? I see one question. No? Okay. Any questions? All good? Okay. So again, just since we know many of you are in the prevention field, we wanted to just bring you back to how your focus groups and key informant information data can inform your needs assessment process, your strategic planning, or your work plan. So again, when you're doing a needs assessment, which we know many of you have to do, the focus groups can help you paint a picture, again, of your community's or region's current problems. And that's important because sometimes your survey data is a year or 2 years out of date, particularly if there's a global pandemic and perhaps you'd last surveyed people before, you might want to think about doing a focus group to find out what's going on right now. What are the needs? What are the resources that people have? How are norms changing? Again, it provides a micro level amount of detail to macro level data. Maybe you don't have local survey data. Maybe you're relying on state or national data, and you're wondering if what you know from that data holds true for your community. And it also importantly can lead you to additional key sources, other folks to interview, other partners to collaborate with. And then for your strategic plan, when you're thinking about what you want to do, whether you're setting yourself up for grant funding or whether organizationally you're taking stock of what you may need to be focusing on in the next several years, doing a focus group or several groups like this, looking at qualitative data can help you identify which strategies and activities that you've been doing or that you might do will help you most effectively address the local conditions or the problems that you've identified. And finally, both Nina and I are evaluation consultants, and that's where we started from. We always look to both quantitative and qualitative data to help us figure out how we will improve our work, how we can either replace activities and strategies that aren't working effectively, or how that the work that we've gathered, the data that we've gathered helps us to prove that the activities and strategies that we are implementing are in fact leading us to the goals and objectives of our work, our organization. So I know that was a lot of information really quickly, and we appreciate everybody bearing with us and staying with us for an hour and a half. Unfortunately, we only have 2 minutes for questions. As I mentioned at the beginning, Nina and I, Jen will be sending out this slide. It has our email information. Jen also just dropped a SurveyMonkey evaluation into the chat, but are there any quick questions we can answer before people move on with the rest of their day?
Doesn't look like we have any questions unless I'm missing any. Oh, Kathy, you have your hand up. Mm-hmm.
Hi, everybody. If you could just elaborate on one thing when it comes to youth and consent. You mentioned, going for those low-hanging fruit opportunities with youth serving organizations that perhaps we already collaborate with. So, and you said that if they've already got some sort of consent policy, can we assume that it's okay for us to engage with those students, or do we need to have the consent for our activity as well?
I would defer to the organization. So for example, I did a focus group at a Boys and Girls Club in Bristol, and they had in the consent form that the parents need to fill out for them to attend that group. They had covered that, they would be participating in various activities, and they felt comfortable allowing me to come in and talk to them. So I deferred to them. But then there might be another organization that doesn't feel that way, and they would want to get that additional consent. So I would defer to them on that. And, Kathy, just one point, the low hanging fruit, it is great, but it's also great to get the kids that aren't typically engaged So go to your alternative high schools, go to
Yeah.
your, go to your faith-based high schools. Don't just go to your public schools to try to recruit these kids, because sometimes the ones that are in these groups are the ones that are already pretty engaged. So thank you. I meant to mention
Sure.
it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Nina and Emily, for this incredible presentation. And I'm sure everyone will get a lot out of it. I'm going to, as Nina and Emily already mentioned, I will follow up with everyone with the slides, with the recording. So you will receive that in the next day, as well as the CEUs for those who will be getting your CEUs out of this as well. Okay. So thank you so much for coming and being with us.
Yeah.
today.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Enjoy the rest of your day.
How you go?